Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, what life is like in the industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Kumu. He offers both public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. And his tours spotlight on the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various park streets and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we will be discussing the cemeteries of Hadley. So tell us about the history of the Protestant cemeteries of Hadley.
Alright, so what we're going to do today is talk about, the Catholic and Protestants, but also Native Americans, and what's the feature on some of these beautiful burial grounds. Now, Hadley has a lot of cemeteries inside of it. You might think that a small place wouldn't have many, but the way it's settled, it was one of the first settlements in western Massachusetts. It was after Springfield came Northampton and Hadley, so very early on, their first cemetery was settled or made. That was in the year 1661, and that was the old Hadley Cemetery. So that was the first Protestant cemetery. What is there is the old pioneers are buried in that section, and the cemetery from there it's a rectangle. It has been filled in, so the oldest are towards the west, the middle burials are towards the middle, and then towards the east are the very modern ones. And it's coming to the point that it's almost filled up. And now the cemetery itself has a gorgeous look to it because it's near the farmland. It's only a third of a mile from the river, and when you go in there, everything is segregated out, and it's hard to see the old part. So you get out of your car, you go to the western part, and you see over a little uprise that is old burials. Now, a couple of them are separate table gravestones. So Reverend Russell and his wife are table gravestones with new legs put below them because the ornamental legs had disintegrated. They also had a descendant put in an inscription of whatever the stone said. So it has modern together with very old. Now, this is just one of the many cemeteries in town, but it has the absolute pioneer, whose name is John Webster, and that's extremely important. Now, the other cemeteries, Protestant cemeteries, there's the North Hadley Cemetery, and in North Hadley, you have a cemetery right near the border, or up near the border of, I believe it's Sunderland or Hatfield, Sunderland, and it was established in 1790. Now, to find this, it's very hard to find because the entrance road is so long and narrow that you can go right by it. So make sure when you're trying to find it, you're looking for a little enclosure driveway with iron rough gate on both sides of it. And then when you get to it, drive up that little hill, and you're going to find the old burial ground up there. Right? Again, it's from 1790. It's much later than the one I was just talking about. But it's close to the North Hadley settlement or neighborhood. The Congregational Church Parsonage is right at the edge of the cemetery. It's painted a gorgeous yellow. And the church itself is no more than 200 yards away. All right, then also in that direction is the Russellville Cemetery. That is truly at the border of Sunderland, only short by 100 feet or so. That was made in 1826. It's a whole neighborhood centered around the Russell family. John and Daniel, the two brothers, settled this area. And there's also a family of Montagues there. And so when you go through this cemetery, you're going to find those family names repeated over and over again. So this Russellville Cemetery is from 1826. Now, in other parts of Hadley, you're going to find more cemeteries, including the Plainville Cemetery, made in 1802. All right, it's near the border with Amherst, and it's in tobacco country along here. And it's a very nice cemetery. It has a nice white fence around it, easy to find. And then once you get inside of it, you see two stones that are very sad to see. The Howard family had three men died during the course of the Civil War, three brothers. The Cowles family had two brothers, also died during the course of the Civil War. Right? So there's one more Protestant cemetery, and that's much further away from the others. And that's called the Hockenham Cemetery. Now, the Hockenham Cemetery is at the border with South Hadley. It was made in the 1780s. It's a dangerous one to get off on because Route 47 is right there with almost no pull-off. So it's hard to get in and out of there very quickly. But be safe there. But you'll be delighted to see some very old stones. They're not the oldest of all. Old Hadley Cemetery has those. But you can see it's a family cemetery. A lot of the same family names will pop up over and over again inside this Hockenham Cemetery. And I have an old picture of it on my website, so I hope you check that out. But you'll meet families like the Lyman family, so forth. Now, next question.
And tell us about the history of the Catholic cemeteries.
All right, there's two Catholic cemeteries. There's the St. Bridget's Cemetery, which was made in Hadley, and it served the 9 communities that the St. Bridget's Church in Amherst was made for. So Hadley, Sunderland, Hatfield, Belchtown, Pelham, Amherst are some of those communities that the St. Bridget's Church was made for, and consequently the St. Bridget's Cemetery holds. Now, it's a nice cemetery. Please go in either one of the entrances, but when you do leave, take only the entrance on the side road because it's not safe going out the other one. But you'll find inside here a baby section because the Catholics didn't allow babies that weren't baptized to be buried with the rest of the people. And you'll find in back a Polish section. And the Polish were buried here up to 1927 because they didn't have their own cemetery in Hadley until then. And that leads on to the Holy Rosary Cemetery, cemetery only 200 yards away towards the west. And in that cemetery, you have a gorgeous priest area. You also have a mausoleum, and you also have some of the earliest burials in the soldiers that died during the war, very close to that mausoleum. Right? So that's the Catholics.
And really quick before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to find out more information or sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find his videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So, getting back to our interview, tell us about the Native American burial grounds in Hadley.
All right, there's 2 Native American burial grounds in Hadley. One is behind the Hockenham Cemetery, what's called Cemetery Hill. 7 of those burials were in Hadley, and 1 was over the border in South Hadley. That was discovered about the year 1902 or so. And also around that time frame, in North Hadley, very close to the North Hadley Cemetery, about 200 yards more to the north by northwest, there is a Native American burial ground there where about 12 burials were found also. And like almost every Native American burial in New England, the torso was upwards, the legs were horizontal. And they were packed with clay from the silt from the river. And thus, Hadley has lots of burials, but you expect that because it's on the river, and most Native American burials would have been along the river itself.
And what is the future of the burial grounds
within Hadley? Well, I would say that these cemeteries might be filling up sometime soon. The Catholic ones might be all right. the Protestant ones, you might need a new burial ground at some point. But in Hadley, you might be okay because there's so much farmland. It'll be easy for the town to just buy up a segment of land and have a new cemetery going. Now, the ones already there are maintained in excellent condition, and I've heard that the head of the cemetery division always in Hadley's history has kept up their cemeteries to a very high level. They've been very proud of them. So the future looks bright for the Hadley cemeteries.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And check out a large selection of other podcasts at his website, as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and videos posted daily. Thank you for joining. Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, what life was like in the industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I'm your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. His tours, he offers public and private tours as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. And currently, the communities that he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight on the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we will be discussing the Old Hadley Cemetery. So describe the Old Hadley Cemetery.
Very old Protestant cemetery in Hadley. How old is it? Probably 1661 was the first burial. Probably started or was ready the previous year. That's extremely old. That's colonial era. And I checked, and it turns out that this is the oldest non-disturbed cemetery within Western Massachusetts. So we're going to talk about today not only the cemetery, but also some of the stones in there, including some raised ones, and about the first burial person, and what's unique about this cemetery. And so if you go there to find the old stones, what you do is you drive or walk into it and then head towards the west or the left part of the cemetery. And they're kind of a bit hidden because you got a tiny little gully there, and then you got another gully, and then you're in the old part. And if you see stones around you that are 1880s on them, you haven't gone far enough into the cemetery. Go to the western wall of it. And then you're going to find all these old burials. What they look like are all the different styles of stones as you went through all those years. The very ancient ones are old brown stones, gravestones. And then you start getting the slate ones, which keep their inscription for hundreds of years very well. And then you'll start to see some of the ones from the early 1800s. And then they look like they started a new section for the later 1800s, and then 1900s and after 2000, that's far to the east. But of great interest, of course, is that section with all the old stones. They, sadly, they're all in basically the right place, but a few things have changed through the years. You're supposed to bury a person with the stone, a headstone, facing towards the west, with the inscription facing towards the west. So you look at the person from that direction, and his head would be right below that headstone. His feet would be pointing towards the east, and a footstone would be there pointing away from the headstone. So the headstone points to the west, the footstone points to the east, and you then have the body head towards the west and feet towards the east. Now, if you go there, there's no footstones. So someone has taken them all out, and about 2/3 of the stones do face west, but some of them point to the east.
And what is the raised gravestones in the cemetery?
All right, now you don't bury a person with raised gravestones. What has happened was descendants of that person noticed that the horizontal stones that are embedded in the ground, whether they're tiny, medium, or large, start to sink into the ground. And they're probably under the ground with sod on top and grass on top. So they probably figured out there's a stone there, and they took it out. And to keep it out of the ground, what you have to do is you go in there, you lift the stone up with a heavy duty equipment, you pour concrete below and let the concrete settle. Then on top of that, you put at least 4 pillars, hopefully 5 or 6 pillars, that are about 2 feet high and very strong. And then you come back with your heavy equipment weeks later, and you put the old horizontal gravestone on top of that arrangement. So a lot of cemeteries are starting to get this look. Catholic cemeteries have some of them. Protestant cemetery have quite a few. This cemetery, I noticed 3 of them were like that, with 2 of them right next to each other because it was a husband and wife. This was the Russell family. So this is a nice solution, and is appropriately done because the concrete will support it, the pillars. But even that someday could be a problem. If you're only putting 4 columns, there's a heavy weight of rock with 6 feet difference between them. I would put 6 pillars under each one of these.
And really quick, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill in our listeners, if you are curious in signing up for any of his various tours, or if you want to find out more information, check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and texts of the historical sites as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, @yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, explain the John Webster gravestone.
All right. He was an officer in the Army and then head of government in Connecticut, and then when he moved to Hadley, he was the same. Now, the burial, he's buried here, but if you look at the stone gives it away. Towards the end, it says, at the end of all the inscription, it says, this stone was put here in 18 something another. He is the first burial of a pioneer, a white pioneer, into Massachusetts that never had its grave moved. So thus, he is the oldest non-disturbed burial of a pioneer in Western Massachusetts. But sadly, the stone has disintegrated away. It's gone. They had to put a replacement stone only 160 years later. They had already put a replacement stone up. And that replacement stone is still here 200 years later, fine, but it's not the original. One good question is, what burial in this cemetery, because this is the only old cemetery in Western Massachusetts that was never disturbed and moved elsewhere, who in this cemetery is the oldest burial with the original stone? That would be a great question to find out. So I'm going to try to find that out, and I'll put them on my webpage, on this particular page, when I do figure it out. But great guy, nice, he's not disturbed, but where's that original stone?
And what is unique about this cemetery?
Okay, it's unique because the Springfield Cemetery would be the oldest cemetery in Western Massachusetts of white settlers. But it was moved in 1848 into the back of the Springfield Cemetery. So the original burials have been moved. The stones are there, the burials are there, but they're not in the right place. Now, another place that's old is Northampton, but the burials of those people used to be in the center of Northampton. They're now in the Bridge Street Cemetery. The pioneers have been moved again. This occurs a lot of places, but the old colonial towns of Western Massachusetts are Hadley, Northampton, and Springfield. And the 2 old ones in Northampton and Springfield have moved, so Hadley's the only cemetery with the old pioneers, very old 1600 pioneers, that have not been moved. Now, if you think that you can look at a stone there and say, great, that means that body below here has never been moved, you're correct, but it might be not the right person for a very peculiar reason. Because it's only about a half mile from the Connecticut River, and any time during those 360 years, if there were floods in the Connecticut River, and it hit that cemetery. The bearers would have stayed there, but the stones would have fallen over and moved a bit. And let's say that you have 5 floods that reach that cemetery. How likely is it that that stone was not moved by that flood and then repositioned after the flood waters receded? Probably, probably not likely. And there's no burial record saying this is where the body should be and where the stone should be, right? Most of those records are long gone. They know that there's bodies in certain places, and they won't bury anyone there again, but they cannot match perfectly. So you might not be able to look at a stone and say, well, this is my 8th great-grandfather here. Maybe not.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And check out a large selection of other podcasts on his website as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and videos posted daily. Thank you, and hope you join us again. Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life is Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Coleman. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of the historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight on the canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks and streets and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we will be discussing the Plainville Cemetery, located in Hadley, Massachusetts. So, what are some of the most interesting features of the Plainville Cemetery?
There's lots of Civil War soldiers here that are buried that died during the Civil War. And that is extremely interesting to see. 3 of them in one family, 2 in another family. All right, and we're going to talk about those families, the Howard and the Cowles, and then what type of cemetery this is by the end. Remember that it's in tobacco country. And so even nowadays, you look around this Plainville Cemetery, and you see tobacco farms and silos and houses. And it's very close to Amherst. You can see the University of Massachusetts very easily in the distance. And it's a beautiful cemetery. You go look at its northern side and get a great view, especially. And there's also the Allen family, which is a cenotaph for the children. That means a monument that has inscriptions for someone that's not really buried in the cemetery. So the Allen's family has, on one side, their children, George, Lucy, Thomas, Anna. All of them died of extremely young age. And it says in the bottom, the children are all buried in Burlington, Vermont. Right? Now, how old is the cemetery? Well, the first formation day was 1802. There might be some supposed burials here before that, but those are cenotaphs. And you can actually find the first burial within the cemetery. It was Isaac Hadley, who died on the 4th of July, 1803. It's fairly easy to see. It's a very bright white slab gravestone. All right, so this is the kind of cemetery. It's great to wander around, see all the very interesting stones. For instance, there's a zinc stone here that's very easy to pick out. And let's talk about the Howard family, though.
So tell us of the Howard family involvement in the Civil War.
They live very close by on a farm. The Hadley family is buried here in the cemetery with a white marble gravestone. There's 3 stars in front of it made of a metallic material that signifies 3 of the people here were in the Civil War and died in the Civil War due to injuries or illnesses. And there were brothers, all 3. Henry Howard died in 1862 in New Bourne. Charles Howard died in 1864, and the Anderson Prison of War Camp in Georgia. He died of illnesses. And Daniel Howard died in 1864 in Portsmouth, Virginia, also dying of illnesses. So it's incredible to see this stone. And when we went there, we made a beautiful video stop right in front of the stone. And I took some nice pictures of it so you can read about the family. Imagine the mother and the father learning of the death of their children so close in years. But it was for a very noble cause.
And real quick, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to find out more information or sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. In there you can also find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, tell us of the Cowles family involvement in the Civil War.
Alright, so the Howard family wasn't the only family that had its tragedies. You can find North Stone towards the middle, near the front gate. But if you go off to the right side of the cemetery through its midsection, and make sure you approach it from an easterly direction towards a westerly direction, you'll see the Cowles stone. And there are the names of two brothers who died 2 weeks apart during the Civil War. Roland Cowles, he died at Cold Harbor, Virginia in 1864, and 2 weeks later his brother Silas Cowles would die due to the Civil War. That is a great tragedy in itself, but now there's 5 brothers, 2 families, that have died due to wars. And can you imagine again the mother and the father hearing the news of all their sons' losses? And this family's house, Cowles, is still visible in the distance. You can enter the street from the cemetery. If you look on this side of the street towards the east, 2 houses away, it was the former Cowles house.
And what type of cemetery is this?
Alright, this is, remember there's four types. One very sophisticated called the rural or garden cemetery that has winding roads and a lot of trees. This is not one of those. This is not truly a lawn cemetery because those weren't made until the 1865 and onwards. It's not a churchyard, there's no church nearby. It's not a family cemetery because it's actually a mix of many different families. It's the 5th kind, the rarest of all, called a neighborhood cemetery, where the town starts up a cemetery and it's usually a rectangular look to it. And it's so far away from the oldest cemetery, usually in the center of town, that they really need to have another one. A lot of towns would build these, especially in extremely rural environments. Hadley definitely was rural, and this cemetery was started up. So the Plainville Cemetery is very unique, a rectangular look to it, but it has many fascinating features as you go through it. And you should always walk around and look around as much as possible. Try to find that old barrier I told you about. Try to find some of the houses that are in the neighborhood that might be of great importance. The Cowles house from 1839 is at 134 Mount Warner Street. And the Hadley house is at 103 Mount Warner Street. Right? And try to find surprises on your own too, because you'll find some beautiful things along the way that I'm not even telling you about. Okay, so thank you for coming.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And of course, we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And check out a large selection of our other podcasts at his website, as well as on soundcloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and videos posted daily. Thank you, and hope you join us again. Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I'm your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Camus. He personally offers and leads public and private tours as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight on local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we will be discussing the North Hadley Cemetery. So, tell us about the North Hadley Cemetery.
All right. Now, one good question is, why would you need a cemetery in this position right here? It was built for a reason. We'll talk about that. And then also we're going to talk about some of the older gravestones in this area. And also we're going to talk about something special near this cemetery that you might not know about at all. All right. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. It's on Route 47. It's very hard to find, though. It's about 1.5 miles north of the center of Hadley, where Russell Street crosses. And if you're going north, it's going to be on the left-hand side. And the entrance is extremely narrow. And it has about 20-foot wide entrance with wrought iron gate and iron fence on both sides. The entranceway is about 140 feet up a little hill, and there's no sign there, and so it's quite hard to find. If you do pass it by, or you're coming from the north anyways, then it's going to be on your right-hand side, and you're going to see it between two front lawns of two houses, and there's a little, like I said, gravel road going up to the back. And this is the only entrance and the only exit. So be careful if you're going in here. Cars really rush on this highway. And also be careful if you exit this way and the cars are really rushing again. So be careful to traffic. Now, it was made in the year 1790, and it has some features nearby that give away why it was made. There's North Hadley Congregational Church, very close by, maybe about 100 yards away to the south. Also, the parsonage of that North Hadley Congregational Church is one of the two houses that is visible from the entranceway. It's a bright yellow, and it's very obviously a colonial era house. And that might help you find the cemetery after all.
And why was the cemetery even built?
All right, now it's only about a linear distance, only about a mile away. And for that reason, why would you have it only a mile away from the old Hadley Cemetery, which is a very similar cemetery? Well, to give you a hint, it's very close to a church, and so you have the old Hadley Cemetery, probably built very close to the original meeting house of Hadley itself in 1660. Hadley was settled in 1659, and it's also but it's also close to that North Hadley Congregational Church, and it gives it away because almost every old-time church would have a graveyard nearby, and the style of the arrangement of it is a churchyard cemetery. So the reason why they built it is because a new church had come into Hadley. And almost always they put a new gravestone nearby. And this one came fairly soon after the first one, because it was only about 130 years after the first one, and they could see that people are really moving to the north part of Hadley. Not many people moving into the middle of Hadley or south of Hadley anymore. So this area really, really grew up quickly.
And real quick before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, to find out more information or if you're interested in signing up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops on each of his tours, as well as photos and videos of historical text sites as well. For private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun educational outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, what are some of the older gravestones like?
All right, they have a lot of shell gravestones with nice little white engravement into it. Some of these are up to 200 years old or more. And that shell is very, very hard to erode. And so thus, even after a couple hundred years later, they're still easy to read. Now, there's also some limestone ones, and they tend to be very dirty. They tend to, of course, start white, but then they end up black from all the dirt and biological agents on them. So they need a good bath or some tender care there. And some of them are, one of the most interesting I saw was a brownstone obelisk of the Smith family. And I found on one side of it the names of Alice Smith and her husband. Um, and it was a very sad story after that. So her husband and her were in a car, probably in the middle of Hadley, and they drove the car across a railroad stop, and the train hit them as it went by. This was in 1910. So Thomas Jerry and Alice Smith, his wife, died instantaneously from that crash. Now you can see two stones that give you the same message there. The brownstone of the Smith family has that, but the Jerry stone, which is only 20 feet away, has the same message of how they were killed. And so you can read it twice. Once on Jerry Stone and once on the Smith Stone. Now, there's a lot of very old stones in the cemetery. Most of them tend to be, as you go in the gate and you park, they tend to be to the right, where you see a lot of ones from early 1800s. I found one from 1812, for instance. And then as you go over towards the middle left side of the path that goes in, you'll see a section of more old stones right there.
And what is near the cemetery that is very special?
All right, very few people realize this, but near this cemetery, maybe about 800 feet away, near the Connecticut River, maybe north by northwest in direction, there is a Native American burial ground. It was discovered in the year, I think it was 1902, by a Smith College professor, and it was investigated by researchers, including some other professors from the college and some students. And they found several burials of Native American here. I would bet in the area around a dozen burials they found with artifacts and so forth. So this is the largest Native American burial site in Hadley, and the largest I know of anywhere in Hampshire County itself. There are other Native American burials in Hadley too, but this one's the biggest. And they did look for artifacts, and in 1991, during the Repatriation Act, they had to give the artifacts and bones back. But at least they know where they are, and there is a scientific professional paper written, and his work, that professor's work, somewhere out there. I hope to link it to my site soon. So it's very interesting to know that there's actually two burial sites, one the pioneers of Hadley and the other the Native Americans, very close by.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. And check out a large selection of our other podcasts at his website, as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and videos posted daily. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days. I'm your host, Carrie, and joining me is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tour spotlight on local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we will be discussing the Russellville Cemetery. So tell us about the Russellville Cemetery.
All right, the whole neighborhood of Hadley, that's in the high northwest, is called Russellville. So this cemetery was started in order to serve the people of that area. Today we're going to talk about the type of cemetery it is. We're also going to talk about the Russell family, and we're also going to talk about some of the interesting gravestones inside this cemetery. Now, if you go there, it's on the high northern part of Route 47 towards the north of Hadley. It's only about 100 feet short of Sunderland, so it's one of the last points in Hampshire County. Now, this cemetery is nicely fenced in by Hadley. They own it. It probably started as family cemetery, but they own it now. It's very well maintained. It probably started about 1826 when families were starting to move out into that area. And the brothers John Russell and Daniel Russell were two settlers in this area. And they are both buried there, and their graves are very easy to find. As you walk in the gate, you just look towards the left front, there's Daniel Russell, and then a few more steps and a couple rows back, there's John Russell. So a lot of the Russell family is buried here. If you count those with Russell names and those with maiden names of Russell, I'm pretty sure close to half of the people in here are Russell family. Maybe 400 burials total for all people and 200 Russell family. Now, if you go there, try to look into the genealogy of the family so you'll be able to catch relationships between people. I'm having a tree made up for myself for the Russell family, trying to find all the connections possible. But I found very easily a few of them, and you can too by just reading the stones. They often tell you who the father and mother of this particular person is, so forth.
And what type of cemetery is this?
It's a family cemetery. Out of the four types of cemetery, this is a family one, started by the Russell family, and it has that look to it still, even though it's been taken over by the town. It has that rustic, small look that a typical family cemetery would have, and have only a very few burials. And it's very easy to maintain in this case because it's made into a straight rows throughout. And some family cemeteries, they don't have that straight row look to it. But this one does, and that's very nice. Now, the other kinds of cemetery could have been would be lawn, rural, and then under rural you have the garden style cemetery, and then a churchyard. Now, there's no churchyard nearby, and this is definitely patterned after a family cemetery. And so that's it. Now, a lot of the Russell family is buried here, and the two founders I mentioned before are found right towards the front left.
And really quick, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to find out more information or sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at hoyocanaltour.org. And there you can also find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, who is this Russell family?
All right, the Russell family is the early settlers into this very, very northern tip of Hadley. And they stayed there a long time, as evidenced by the gravestones. They probably some of the Russell family still around. And for instance, the Russell farmhouse is just to the left of the entrance of the cemetery. That's the old John Russell homestead. And other settlers in the area included William Montague, and William Montague fought in the Revolutionary War, and he's also buried in this cemetery, and he has a small little plaque. You don't know he's a veteran of the Revolutionary War. So this is a cool little place to be in. It's the very definition of a farm neighborhood. And if you look around if you look around from the cemetery, you can see barns and farmhouses around.
And what is the most interesting gravestone?
All right, the most interesting one, the one that catches my eye, is that of one of the Russell families, and the reason why is because it says right on it that he fought in the Civil War and he died in the Civil War because of his injuries. He went into the Civil War in 1861, and he would die by 1864. This is John Russell. There's a lot of John Russells here. This is the one that's buried behind his grandfather, John Russell. His father is inscribed on the same gravestone as he, and he's John Russell too. And then there's another John Russell, 3 John Russells in a genealogical family in a row. He would die as a sergeant on the 3rd of June, 1864 in Cold Harbor, Virginia. His body would be brought back and would be buried in the Russellville Cemetery. And it says that on the stone, so when you see it, it's off to the left and towards the front. He was a very young person of 22 years old about, and he followed after his the farmer family, of course. He was in the Company D in the 27th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, and he's promoted to sergeant on March 23rd, 1863, and then he was killed. Now it's down on the stone that he's the only son of John and Persis Russell. So it's a very interesting stone to read. He's the bottom of his father's gravestone. So I hope you find it, and I hope you enjoy the cemetery overall. It's a nice, quaint little cemetery.
Thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our listeners. And check out a large selection of our other podcasts at his website, as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and videos posted daily. Thank you, and hope you join us again. Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life is Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I'm your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Kumlo. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the Hockenham Cemetery. So tell us about the Hockenham Cemetery.
Alright, this is a cemetery in Hadley, Massachusetts that is on Route 47, and it's in a neighborhood called Hockenham. It's become a cemetery that's a neighborhood cemetery, but it probably didn't start that way. There were very few neighborhood cemeteries in the 1700s. That's mostly a concept from the 1800s. And so when it started in the late 1700s, maybe 1780s or so, it was probably a family cemetery, and it was probably the Lyman family cemetery. And it grew from there. It's quite narrow and only about 140 yards, 40 feet long. Right? Not too many barrels in there, but most of the ones that are there are quite old. So it's the second oldest cemetery within Hadley. The reason why it probably started was, sure, there was Old Hadley Cemetery, but that was, towards the west center of Hadley. Hadley's a very long town in the north-south direction. It's approximately 7 miles long and only about 3.5 miles wide. So there were farmers starting to settle in the southern part of Hadley, and the community probably got sick of taking all the barrels up to the Old Hadley Cemetery, and so they started for themselves a family cemetery that became a neighborhood cemetery. Now, if you go there, make sure you find a safe place to park in the very beginning.
And what type of neighborhood is the cemetery found in?
Okay, this neighborhood is an agricultural neighborhood. There's now many farms up there, including one large farm that's has a restaurant too. But it also has the the Mount Hood Range Star right there, and Skinner Mountain and Skinner Museum is on the top of it now. From up there, they got a grand view of the Connecticut River Valley, the Connecticut River itself, and the Hokanum neighborhood of Hadley. And this is a really cool neighborhood, and it's hopefully they can preserve it this way. Most of the land has been bought out by quasi-public institutions in order to preserve the land. Someone wanted to build up on the mountain about 40 years ago, and there was a groundswell of activity to buy up all the land before that could happen. So most of the mountain range is now in public hands of some form, and that could be via the Kestrel Land Trust, by Massachusetts itself, Hadley or South Hadley Conservation Lands, are private groups that are committed to preservations. And then the farms themselves are quite gorgeous. A lot of the outer meander of the Connecticut River through there is still farmed. And so for that reason, it's a very unique place to go to. One of my most favorite places around Massachusetts. I try to bring people up to the top of the mountain to see the great view.
And quickly before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, for more information or to sign up for various tours, check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, tell us about the Native American burials behind the cemetery.
Yes, about in the year 1900, there were found 8 Native American burials behind this cemetery as the land rises towards the southeast. And those burials, all Native Americans were there because Native Americans like to live along the river, and this was close to the river. They like to bury close to the river too. And Native American burials are with the legs out, torso upwards, and then encased in clay, and these were. 7 of the burials were in land that's Hadley. One of the burials was found a little bit further on in South Hadley, but only a few, not even 100 feet away. So it's very close to the others. That's because the Hokanum Cemetery is right on the border itself. And so this is one of 2 major sites within Hadley that they found Native Americans buried near. Both of them happen to be near cemeteries themselves. And that is quite unusual. The other group was found in the Russellville Cemetery. So that's a lot of Native American burials, but you expect that in a flat land place, which is right on the Connecticut River. You can almost guess that. Now, Hadley is not heavily developed through most of its area, and so expect to find more in the future because homes will be built, foundations dug up, and there'll be more along the way.
And last but not least, compare this to other cemeteries in Hadley.
All right, so I just told you about the 2 Native American locations. There's also, besides the Hokanum Cemetery, there's 2 Catholic cemeteries, the St. Bridget's Cemetery and the Holy Rosary Cemetery. They have Catholic burials, of course. Now, it best compares to some of the Protestant cemeteries, and there's 5 of those total, but 4 beyond the Hokanum. So the Old Hadley is the oldest of all. Hokanum is the second oldest. So Old Hadley comes from the 1660s. Hokanum comes from about 1780s. Now there's 3 neighborhood cemeteries, the North Hadley, the Plainville, and the Russellville. Those all started out as neighborhood cemeteries by design and mostly made by the town of Hadley itself. and they were needed because Hadley is so spread out, and it was getting difficult to bring bodies constantly to the old Hadley Cemetery, which is mostly along the west border. And so they built two in the north, one in the east, and the Hockanum was in the deep south. So it compares to them only a bit. They're all in Hadley, they're all Protestant, but otherwise, this is probably the only family cemetery within Hadley. Three of the others are neighborhood cemeteries. And one was the old Hadley Cemetery of all. Now, they're all put into straight lines at this point, but all of them would have started out as being grouped by families, and they're all old enough that they would have had the body lying in the east-west axis, so the head of it rose up would face towards the east. But they've been changed since then, just like the Hockanum has been quite a bit.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And of course, we want to thank our listeners as well. And you can find more podcasts on his website as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and videos posted daily. Thank you, and hope you join us again.